All right, we are live. Welcome back, everyone. Happy Friday. And I have to start by saying, of course, right before I hit to go ahead and start the broadcast, the recycling truck showed up right outside my window. And it's as if they know. Now, here's the weird thing. I live in a small section of La Jolla just outside of San Diego. Apparently, people in my building drink so much that they have to get the recycling 3 times a day. And it's always when I'm on a podcast or doing an interview or something. So, anyway, it made me think, Greg, before we started, we were chatting a little bit in the green room about your situation there. And I thought actually our viewers would love to hear about that. You said you had put your neurotic dog away.
Yeah, my wife is an animal lover, and that means my two daughters are animal lovers. So we have two big dogs, one little dog, and a cat. And the neurotic dog I had to put in the kennel before this because invariably she likes to bark when I'm on panels or being interviewed. So. We've taken care of that. That doesn't mean a marching band isn't going to come walking by my front door, but
well, you're in Kansas City, right? So we're getting ready for the big game. There should be a marching band outside your door.
Yeah.
Where exactly are you in KC?
Well, I live in a smaller town called Fairway, which is a suburb of Kansas City, and in fact, most suburbs on the Kansas side are actually suburbs of Kansas City, Missouri.
Right.
But that's where I am today.
Awesome. Well, I want to welcome everybody wherever you are and remind you, please, if you are on LinkedIn Live or Facebook Live, type something in the chat box and let us know you're here, as well as where you are streaming in from. And fingers crossed, my dad is here somewhere. Really funny story that my dad at one point a few years ago, Greg, you will appreciate this, was doing a Google search. I can't believe I'm going to say this. It's so funny. He was doing a Google search for my name. And he was so impressed that when you type in Heidi Hanna, it was actually me. And then he typed in his name and it wasn't actually him. And so he said to me, hey, how do you make it do that? I want it to show me when people search for me. And I said, well, I guess we start by giving you a LinkedIn page. I mean, I don't even know at this time. I didn't even know why that was happening. So we did get him a LinkedIn page and I did send him the link. So hopefully he is joining us. And if he is, Dad, type in the comment section once you get to this stream and let us know you're here. You probably don't have a picture on your page because I don't think we got that far, but just say hello from Coeur d'Alene and we will know that it's you. So, Greg, I'm so excited to talk to you. This is our Stress Mastery show. And as I was telling you, I don't usually talk about politics because I get so stressed. It has had an influence on my relationships. When it comes up in conversation, here's the weird thing. I love to talk about politics and I'm super open-minded. I just love to hear where people are coming from. I love to learn about it. I get pretty fired up about things. There's some things happening right now in California, shocker. I'm pretty fired up about, like getting kids out to play sports and making sure that law enforcement is getting COVID vaccines as first responders. And there's things like that where I really try to hear all sides of the story. And for a long time, I've been kind of shutting down my voice on it because I don't want to ruffle any feathers. And there's been a couple of things lately that have just gotten me to the point where I want to open up the dialogue. And I also want to feel a little bit more empowered with the knowledge to know what I can do to be helpful in speaking up, but also in listening more. So the first person I thought of was you. We've been friends for a long time. You and my dad have done some business together and some golfing together and some different things. So I've known about your journey. I know about your book, which I think is phenomenal. I love the title of this book too, Declaration of Independence. But I have to be honest, I don't know much about political parties and what it means to be independent. I always kind of say, well, I'm not this and I'm not that, but I'm not sure if I'd call myself an independent because I don't really know what that means. So could you kind of start for those of us who maybe have stayed out of this a bit more on the fringe and let us know a little bit more about like your book and the concept you're talking about and what it means to be independent?
Sure, happy to. And I think you're right in trying to avoid talk of politics if you're in a stress mastery course, because for a lot of people, politics does invoke a lot of stress. We've gotten to a point in our country right now where we have two dominant parties. We've had those two dominant parties for a long time. But it's only been recently, the last couple of decades, where those parties have gotten to a point where they really can't work together anymore. And there's a whole lot of causes behind that. In fact, I list many of them in my book and talk very specifically about things like how the media impacts our partisan divide. But suffice it to say that I do not believe the system as it's structured right now is a system that's built to carry us forward, solve our problems, and ultimately create better lives for the American people. And it's in large part because Democrats and Republicans, particularly Democratic and Republican leaders, really sort of behave like a bitter married couple going through a bad divorce. You know, they don't talk to each other anymore. When they do talk, they mistrust each other's intentions. They don't have the same goals anymore. And getting those people, Democratic and Republican leaders, to solve our problem is a little bit like taking that bitter divorcing couple and putting them in a room and saying, figure it out on your own.
Right.
It's just not going to happen without the intervention of a third force. And again, for a whole range of reasons. So for me, being politically independent really is about three things. It's about putting my country and my state ahead of the needs of any political party. And I often say that Democrats and Republicans don't want to see our country succeed. They want to see the other party fail. And so for me, it's really about putting my country and my state first. It's about thinking for myself and not clinging to rigid ideologies. You know, there was a test that was done by an organization called the Bipartisan Policy Center, I believe it was in 2013, where they polled 500 individuals about an education reform plan. And they referred to Plan A as the Republican plan and Plan B as the Democratic plan. Well, as you might imagine, 75% of Republicans like Plan A and only 10% or so like Plan B. And 75% of Democrats like Plan B and only 10% or so like Plan A. They then went to another group of 500 people with the same question, except they now called Plan A the Democratic plan, Plan B the Republican plan. And invariably now 75% of Democrats like Plan A and 75% of Republicans like Plan B. We've stopped thinking when we engage in these party labels. And so for me, the second reason I'm an independent is because I think for myself. I don't cling to rigid ideologies, and I certainly don't allow the label that we place on a policy to determine whether or not I think it's a good policy or a bad policy, a good idea or a bad idea. And the third reason I'm an independent is because I do not want to be obligated to party bosses or special interests. And I think the parties have largely become aggregation points for special interests right now. And so ultimately, they're not interested in what's in the best interest of the American people. They're private gain-seeking organizations that are interested in one thing and one thing only, and that is staying in power. And I don't think that serves the interests of the American people, and it's why my journey has now involved saying no to both parties, declaring my independence, and ultimately working to create an environment where we can build a real, true, and genuine third force in our politics so that we can get back in the business of solving problems again for the American people.
I just am almost speechless, which never happens. And so I share with you guys, this is why I wanted to have this conversation. It makes me emotional. We're also getting some great comments from people. And I've suggested, let us know, especially if you're on LinkedIn Live. I can't always type back to you in the comments, but I can pop your notes up here. So I see Joshua Barnes is here from LinkedIn Live. And Josh, I think you are maybe one of our fellow instructors as well in the LinkedIn Learning group there. We've got Jennifer, one of our big fans, our favorite people in Arizona there. And I also just want to say, and this is interesting, this is one of my stress mastery educators who has a great name, by the way, Heidi. But she just emphasizes that politics is a huge stressor. Now, these are the types of things too that always make me a little stressed out because we're talking about one party or one person or one thing. And I think it's so easy to not understand supporting another person or even another group of people. I mean, I had a knockdown, drag out fight with my best friends just a week ago. And the fight wasn't about their viewpoint because they are Trump supporters, they are Republican. And I understood everything they were saying about why they felt the way that they did. I honestly did. There's, to me, almost like the rule of improv, which is yes and. All I wanted them to do was hear what I wanted to contribute to the conversation. And in this case, probably because we had a little bit too much wine, they literally could not listen to me. And by the third time I said, all I'm asking you to do is hear me, I finally said, I just can't have this conversation. I love you. Let's pick this up another time. The funny thing is, then they felt like I didn't want to talk about it. And they said, well, this is why we don't talk about politics. My opinion is, I just want us to listen. Can we just hear the other side? And I think what you're saying about choosing particular policies and different things, but it just gets so wrapped up into this partisan effort. So would you share a little bit about your journey? And I'm curious too, because last time we really connected, you were running for office. And I remember, actually, this is funny because earlier this week, I interviewed Warren Rustand, who's a good friend of mine and who has been in politics before, worked in the White House for a while. And I was with Warren teaching Global Leadership Academy for Entrepreneurs Organization. And we were watching some of the coverage of the election. And I remember him saying to me, sounds like your friend Greg is a great guy. There's no way he's going to win this office. And he gave me all of this info, like behind the scenes stuff. And it totally had to do with parties and who's been there the longest and who the funding comes from and all that. It was fascinating to me. And I remember again in that moment thinking, I'm so grateful that you are still doing this and you're doing it in a new way. And I believe that now's the time, like we have a whole new generation of people who I think are really open to this idea. So long way of saying, can you tell a little bit more about your background? And then do you feel like this is a time that independent thinking can be at the forefront?
Sure, happy to. Well, I tell everybody I came by my interest in politics, honestly. My maternal grandfather was actually Hubert Humphrey's top aide for 25 years. And so my mother, as you might imagine, was a Democrat because her father was a Democrat. In fact, my mother was a nurse. She was in the nurses union. She talked to me about issues of gender equality for as long as I can remember. And again, very much a Democrat. My father, on the other hand, was a small business owner and had a small furniture store in Kansas City, and was what I would consider to be more of a business Republican. And I remember as a kid going to a program called Boys Nation in Washington, D.C. If you've seen pictures of Bill Clinton with John F. Kennedy, I was there. In fact, the picture behind me, I don't know if you can see it in the frame, is me and Ronald Reagan together.
Oh, yeah.
But I came home excited and energized about politics. And I said to my dad, I think I might want to be in politics one day. And he quipped, well, why don't you skip the internship and go straight into crime? And so, wow. So he very much had that perspective. But he had a serious point. He said to me, Greg, you might decide to go into politics one day. But I really would recommend that if you do it, become financially secure first. Put yourself in a position where you can truly do what's right and not worry about whether or not you get elected or get reelected.
Right.
And so for me, running as an independent is in some ways a manifestation of that warning that my father gave me. I've gotten myself to a point where I want to do this the right way. Yeah. I did run for the U.S. Senate in 2014 as an independent, and got to the point where I was actually leading in the polls.
Right.
And then during the last 3 weeks of the election, the Republican Party came in and spent heavily, in fact, spent roughly $17 million in 3 weeks, trying to paint me, believe it or not, as a Democrat. That was their argument. He's really not an independent. He's a Democrat. That was the best argument they had against me, and sort of pushed me back into that blue-red frame where people were making a partisan decision and not making a decision based on the merits of the candidate. In fact, in polling that was done, 2 out of 3 people who voted for my opponent in that race said they actually thought I was the better candidate. And in fact, but they wanted a Republican Senate. That was actually a sentiment that George Will, the political writer, echoed in one of his articles. He said, the Senate's intellectual wattage would be increased by Greg getting elected, but improving 1% of the Senate isn't enough of a reason to potentially leave the Democrats in charge.
Amazing.
And so, that's sort of been my experience. After that election, I actually got together with Bob Dole in Washington, D.C., and Senator Dole had actually marshaled a whole lot of resources against me, but had sent a number of smoke signals up suggesting he wanted to meet. And so I went and met with him. And he said something to me that was really telling. He said, if you'd have just said you were going to be a Republican, you'd be in the U.S. Senate right now.
Right.
And I actually knew that. I had a lot of people advising me that, just say you're going to be a Republican and it's checkmate and you're going to win this election.
Right.
But I asked Senator Dole the question that I asked so many of those people. I said, would I be getting anything done? And he thought about it for a second and he said, no, you wouldn't. And I'm really sad about that. And, my point, and the point I made to Senator Dole, and the point I made to all those other people who said this is what you need to do to get elected, was I'd rather play golf. Right. I'd rather play golf than sit in Washington, D.C. as a U.S. Senator and get nothing done. Because as far as I'm concerned, that's not a productive use of time. I do think, to your point, I do think we are in an environment right now where people are looking for alternatives. You just have to look at the election in 2016 as an example. Between Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, two candidates that were considered outsiders, two candidates that the establishment on both sides thought had no chance of winning, got 45% of the votes in all of the primaries. 41% of Americans now self-identify as politically independent. They don't want to be considered part of either party. Yeah. And ultimately, it's driven in large part by a belief that Washington is really leaving them behind. 85% of Americans agree with the statement that Washington is a rigged game that only benefits those people who can buy access to power. Right. And by the way, by every measure, they're right. You think about the environment in 2016, and it's only slightly different right now, and obviously different because of the pandemic in part and because of 4 years of Donald Trump. Right. But in 2016, when Donald Trump got elected, median household income in America hadn't risen for 17 years. Think about that for a second. The amount of time it takes a child to go from being born to entering their senior year in high school, that's how long it'd been since the average American family had a pay increase.
Wow.
At the same time, the things they spend so much money on, healthcare, childcare, higher education, have so far outstripped the rate of inflation that for the average American family, it didn't feel like you were treading water. It felt like you were drowning.
Right.
And so, of course, they went looking for something different. Of course, they're looking for alternatives to this system that has just left so many people behind. And that's really where I think we have the opportunity to create a third force, is in presenting a vision to those people that's compelling enough to get them to do something that isn't perceived as safe. Right. And that is vote for what they want and what they hope for, and for candidates who inspire them, instead of voting against what they fear and what they hate. And that's what we have today, is a negative partisanship. Donald Trump is saying there's no way Joe Biden got 80 million votes.
Right.
I agree. There's no way Joe Biden got 80 million votes. He probably got 10 or 12 million votes, and 68 to 70 million people voted against Donald Trump.
Right.
And, that's the kind of politics we have. We have negative partisanship today, where we're defined not by who inspires us, by who we love, by who has the vision that we want to see. We're inspired primarily by what we hate and who we fear. And that isn't a pathway forward.
That's right. So I want to just share again, for those of you who are watching, it's wonderful to see your comments. And from time to time, I do want to pop those up here. So please continue to engage in the conversation here. I'm just looking for one from my buddy Ted. And Ted, I just had it up here a second ago. Where did you go? If I'm going to get you back here in just a moment. Oh, there you are. So my friend Ted, former Nittany Lion, I must say, had a comment here about having to learn how to do that, having worked for both parties. So Ted, I'd love to hear more about that and what kind of strategies you used or what you had to do to navigate that, if you're willing to share that with us. I also made a note here, Greg, that I know you will appreciate, because when I went to college at Penn State, I wanted to be a teacher. And I've always wanted to be a teacher. In fact, when people would ask me about my purpose in life and what did you like to do when you were a kid, I would take my stuffed animals and set them around and I would teach them things. Like I did that. And I was 25. No, I'm kidding. I was, when I was young, I would do this, and I still have stuffed animals around. But my dad said to me, Why don't you make money and help people at the same time? And I remember at first I was kind of pissed at him because I felt like he was condescending me and saying that the role of a teacher isn't important. And I have to say now, I mean, I could not be more passionate about helping teachers. I do speaking engagements for educational organizations and PTAs, and I'm doing one for a middle school here in San Diego in a couple of weeks. I will do that, and I can do it for free because I'm doing other things with corporations and making money and having resources so that I can do that. So I think sometimes there's this piece of, how do we integrate all of this? How do we bring companies and organizations? How do we get people behind the ideas that matter? And so my question to you, based on what you just said, is if 41% of people are identifying as an independent, then why does it feel like it would be absolutely impossible to get an independent person in office? Is that just finances?
Well, part of it is. And, the first comment I would make is I'm sure your dad was coming from a place of wanting to get you off the payroll. So I don't know that it actually.
I'm still making him pay, trust me.
Yeah. The challenge that we have, if you think about it, is we have a system where the two major parties, the one thing they agree on is staying in power. And as a result of that, they've rigged the rules in such a way to make it very difficult for anybody to challenge them. Money is one area. As an example right now, if you want to give money to an independent candidate, you can give $2,800 a year. You know how much money you could give to the Democratic Party in a year if you wanted to? Answer is $830,000. So
how is that even justifiable? That makes no sense to me. That's not even
logical. It's justifiable because no one pays attention to the rules. And I sort of wrote a whole chapter in my book about how they rigged the rules.
Wow.
But I sort of likened it to baseball, a sport I know you have some familiarity with.
Right.
If you had a situation with Major League Baseball where the team that won the pennant got to change one rule every year, but make sure it only applied to them. As an example, the Kansas City Royals could say, we get 4 outs when we're up to bat, but everybody else gets 3.
Right.
And the New York Mets could say, we get a 10th fielder, everybody else is stuck with 9. Right. Eventually, you would get to a point where the only teams that meet in the World Series would be the Kansas City Royals and the New York Mets.
Well, and that's what the Padres. I mean, give San Diego a chance.
and that's what's happened in our politics. We've rigged the rules in such a way to make sure that's happened. So much of what I've spent my time on over the past several years is working with organizations who are trying to change the rules so that we can create a more level playing field and get more accountable government, because that's the thing that doesn't happen. When you create a scenario where one party or another is guaranteed to win, you eliminate all accountability from the process. Competition brings accountability, which will bring better results for the American people. And so that's what we're working on right now, is changing the rules. One of the things I will tell you, however, as an independent and as someone who's campaigned now twice as an independent, I had the benefit of doing something that most political candidates don't get the benefit of doing, which is I got to speak to groups of people from across the political spectrum.
Right.
Generally speaking, if you're a Republican running for office and you do a town hall, who shows up? A whole bunch of Republicans.
Right.
If you're a Democrat and you do a town hall, a whole bunch of Democrats show up. And what I've been able to determine is by getting people in the same room and actually getting them to listen to each other, as you've described, there's a whole lot more common ground out there among Americans than our politicians would like us to believe. Right. Our politicians use division to win elections.
Right.
They use negative campaigning to win elections. You don't win elections by saying my opponent's a relatively decent human being and we have some modest disagreements, but I think you should vote for me and not him or her. You win elections by painting your opponent as the worst possible version of themselves, lying about them if necessary, using fear, hate, and division to get people to vote against them. And it's had a long-term impact on our politics. I like to say the Democratic and Republican parties are the two worst consumer brands in the world for one really simple reason. They're defined exclusively by negative advertising. I mean, think about it. If Coke and Pepsi did that, Coke said Pepsi makes you 3 inches shorter. Pepsi said Coke makes your hair fall out. Nobody would drink Coke or Pepsi. Right. We drink water, beer, wine, whatever.
Right.
But we wouldn't drink Coke or Pepsi. The reason it works in our politics, the reason we can create such a negative environment in our politics is because we have only two choices.
Right.
If you had a legitimate third force in your politics, negative campaigning would be far less effective. And the political culture would be far less stressful. The political culture would be far more oriented around listening, working together, finding solutions to shared problems, teasing out that common ground, and not dividing people. Right. And so that's another reason why I'm working so hard to create that third force, is because I think it will have a very positive effect on our political culture.
So two things that just made me think of. One is it reminds me of a pastor of a church that I go to here in San Diego. So actually, I can't even choose a church. I go to two churches. One's in San Diego, one's in North Carolina, and they're both amazing. But Miles McPherson here in San Diego at the Rock Church talks about the third option. And he has a book called The Third Option. It's actually about race relations. And so what you're talking about here, even though it's obviously a different area, it reminds me so much of that same thing about our need to hear each other out and really be open to listening to people's experiences. So if somebody from an African-American community is trying to talk to me, I don't get so defensive that I start justifying that I didn't have a slave, or I didn't do this, or I didn't do that. I listen and I put myself in their shoes and I understand their journey. For them to be right doesn't mean that I have to be wrong. So it's like, how do we get out of that survival-based instinct that happens in the brain, which is what my work is about? How do we get out of that so we don't have to defend our ego, but we can listen and do this kind of yes and thing? That was the first thing that came to mind. The second thing, just as a kind of a funny thing, is at one point I actually considered dating a politician, and you'll get a kick out of this. My first thought was, this guy's a really great guy, but if they're going to look for things to attack him on and they start looking into my background, I'm a little frightened. So I was like, I'm out, because they could use me as like a reason to not elect this person. It's too scary for me.
Well, sadly, they don't need the truth anymore to find negative things. They can just make it up.
Thank God there was no social media or TikTok or things back in the days. My softball college teammates and I have been laughing about that for the longest point, because if it was, well, I said I wouldn't have the career I have right now, because I used to like to have a couple beers and sing off of the balcony downtown and State College. But then we decided, well, I could be on Dancing with the Stars by now. So, I mean, it's hard to know exactly what would happen. Hey, before we wrap up, because I know we're getting short on time, would you talk about some of the organizations you're working with and what you are actually doing now? Because I know people are going to be excited about your message.
Sure. Well, one of the things I was going to mention, to your point about race relations, I am being featured in a documentary called The Reunited States. And two of the storylines in that documentary are actually quite powerful on the issue of race. One is a woman named Susan Bro, who lost her daughter, Heather Hare, at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. Susan was the mother of the young woman who was killed. The other are a group of people, Aaron and David Leverton, who actually rented an RV, sold their house, and traveled across the United States to try to figure out and try to do the listening to really figure out what divides us. And I think it's quite a powerful documentary. Again, the Reunited States. I think it's launching actually in February. It'll be available on all the streaming services, et cetera. There is an apt analogy when you think about racism and partisanship. If you go back to the 1960s, people were asked a question: would you be displeased if your child married someone from the opposite political party? Mm-hmm. About 4% of Democrats and 5% of Republicans said yes. That same question was asked 50 years later in 2010, and a third of Democrats and 49% of Republicans said yes. I suspect if you ask that question today, more than 50% of both Democrats and Republicans would say they would be displeased if their child married someone from the opposite political party. Partisanship has become the new prejudice. We are now more concerned about our children marrying someone from a different political party than a different race or religion. And that just sort of demonstrates how bad it gets. To your point on the third way, the book that was written by your pastor, there's another great pastor here in Kansas City named Adam Hamilton. He's at the Church of the Resurrection, And he's actually written a book called Seeing Gray in a World of Black and White. So I think there's a lot we can look to in terms of some of those leaders and in terms of how to unpack this and start to talk to each other and start to really listen. And that is the key, is making sure that when you talk to someone of the opposite political party, you're not trying to win an argument. Right. Your goal should be to try to understand. And if you start with the goal in mind that you want to understand the other person, I guarantee you will find common ground.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, of course, I want to know, I know others are going to ask, and we'll just kind of wrap up with this. Is there any chance that you will run again?
You know, at some point in the future, maybe. I actually genuinely really enjoyed the process. I love being able to meet with people, talk to them about issues they cared about, hear about their lives. There was nothing more gratifying to me than having that privilege and that honor to be able to do that. But I've got a young family right now, and it certainly would have to be the right opportunity, the right time. And so, again, I never say never, but we're going to keep working on creating that third force.
And any other groups or organizations? I think you talked about a couple of other ones. Maybe you could just mention.
Well, the Institute for Political Innovation is an organization that I've been working with that's advocating for a different type of voting method called ranked choice voting. Actually, they've got a very specific version of it that helps us get to better answers. An organization called Unite America is one that I've been involved with. And again, they're advocating for 4 very specific reforms that ultimately will create more competition, better representation, and better outcomes for people. And then, you can obviously follow me on my own website, which is greg-orman.com. Occasionally I write articles and occasionally I tweet and do stuff on Facebook, though. There's no sort of organized effort there right now.
Are you on TikTok yet? That's the question.
I'm not on TikTok. My 5-year-old would be a far better TikTok personality than I would.
I'm just telling you right now it's going to happen. I just got talked into it. There's nothing there, so don't go looking anybody, but I'm officially going on TikTok. So okay, I'm so glad you were here. Hey, you guys, I just want to let you know one other thing that this leads us into, and that is there's a lot going on in my life I'm excited to share with you. So on Monday, I'm going to be my own guest. I know that sounds really boring to some of you, but I have a lot to say. So I'm going to wrap up what some of these conversations have been like lately and tell you about a really exciting new project that I'm working on. This is not available yet, but I'm just going to give you a little preview that we're going to be talking about a new documentary and a TV show that we're doing called Jet Set Mindset. I'm going to invite Greg back to be part of that as well. We're going to be talking to people who've had success and struggle in their life. We're going to figure out what makes them successful and what they've done to overcome challenges, as well as if there's any fine-tuning that they need at this point in their life. So we've got a bunch of NFL athletes, we've got some professional golfers, we've got people in business, people in politics. They're going to be really good conversations where we actually do listen to each other. And our goal is try to reduce the stigma on mental health issues and give people really practical things that they can do. So you'll hear me share more about that on Monday. And then every Monday is going to be a Jet Set Mindset edition of the Stress Mastery Show. So that'll be a lot of fun too. So with that, Greg, thank you so much. As I expected, this was an awesome conversation. We could have kept going. So I hope you will come back and do this with me again.
Happy to. Good to see you.
Okay, good to see everyone. And by the way, go Chiefs. Looking forward to hopefully another Super Bowl championship for Kansas City.
Well, that's actually a foregone conclusion. So no need to even watch the game.
There we go. Yeah. All right, we'll see you all next time. Bye for now.